This title slide frames the study as an interdisciplinary contribution at the intersection of law, financial regulation, and artificial intelligence. Corresponding author, Assistant Prof. Aymen Almayyahi. The authors in this paper from Southern Technical University, Iraq, Istanbul Gedik University, Turkey. This slide previews the presentation logic. He would explain that the paper begins with the emergence of enabled fraud, then evaluates why inherited Iraqi laws are inadequate, introduces the research design, summarizes the simulation findings, and closes with an implementable reform agenda. This roadmap helps the audience follow both the doctrinal and technical components of the study. The background to the study is the simultaneous expansion of two forces: digitized financial services and the sophistication of AI-enabled fraud. I would emphasize that AI does not merely improve efficiency, it also lowers the cost and increases the realism of fraudulent impersonation. Iraq is especially relevant because the banking sector is digitizing while core legal texts remain anchored in earlier technological assumptions. The central problem is not only that fraud is increasing, but that its modalities have changed. AI-enabled fraud can mimic trusted identities and manipulate decision systems in ways that do not fit neatly into older legal categories. I would stress that when law relies on analogy rather than direct regulation, enforcement becomes uncertain and deterrence weakens. I would use this slide to explain why the paper matters beyond a purely descriptive exercise. The study contributes new doctrinal analysis for Iraq, but it also offers operational value for regulators and banks. Its significance lies in combining legal diagnosis with an implementable governance response, rather than treating technology and law as separate domains. This slide distinguishes the general aim from the operational objectives. During delivery, I would explain that the paper is not merely cataloging fraud risks. It systematically evaluates Iraqi law, compares alternative models, and then designs a reform roadmap that can be adapted to Iraq's institutional capacity and regulatory environment. I would present these questions as the backbone of the paper. The first clarifies the threat. The second evaluates the present legal framework. The third looks outward to comparative law. And the fourth translates the analysis into concrete Iraqi reforms. Together they connect empirical risk, legal diagnosis, and normative design. This hypothesis is deliberately strong. I would explain that the paper does not argue for minor interpretive adjustment alone. It argues that the current framework is structurally insufficient. The key terms are lacunae, deterrence, and feasibility. The research therefore tests both inadequacy and the practicality of reform. The paper uses two analytical lenses. Routine activity theory helps explain why digitized financial systems are attractive targets for AI-enabled fraud. Institutional theory then helps answer a different question: how comparative legal solutions can be adapted to Iraq rather than imported in a purely formal way. I would stress that one framework explains the threat, while the other guides the reform strategy. In discussing the literature, I would emphasize the movement from general cybercrime analysis towards specific concern with AI-enhanced fraud. The key point is that deepfakes and automated decision manipulation now operate as practical financial crime techniques. This justifies treating them as a distinct regulatory problem rather than a subset of ordinary digital fraud. This slide shows that Iraq is not confronting the problem in a vacuum. The comparative literature reveals different regulatory styles. The European Union emphasizes ex-ante risk governance. The United States relies more heavily on fragmented guidance and enforcement. And the UAE offers direct relevance for synthetic media and impersonation offenses. I would explain that the study selectively borrows from these models rather than treating any one of them as universally transferable. The research gap is twofold. Substantively, Iraq has received little dedicated academic analysis on AI-enabled financial fraud. Methodologically, there is also a gap between legal scholarship and operational fraud detection discussions. I would explain that this paper addresses both gaps by linking doctrinal analysis to simulation findings and then translating the combined evidence into a national reform roadmap. I would explain that the methodology is intentionally pluralistic because the research question itself is interdisciplinary. The legal dimension requires doctrinal interpretation, while the fraud control dimension requires performance analysis. The comparative layer connects the two by showing how external models can inform a context-sensitive Iraqi framework. Here, I would clarify that doctrinal analysis in the paper is not limited to reading statutory text in isolation. It asks whether the conceptual architecture of the statutes can genuinely accommodate AI-mediated deception. The comparative element then evaluates which external mechanisms are suitable for legal transplantation into Iraq's institutional environment. This slide explains the design of the simulation model. I would note that the dataset is synthetic because Iraq-specific representative fraud data are limited, but the simulation is still policy relevant because it was calibrated to the banking context described in the paper. The thresholds are intentionally stringent because the study prioritizes avoiding missed fraud even at the expense of more alerts. I would explain that these metrics matter because legal and regulatory priorities rarely align perfectly with technical optimization. In this study, recall is privileged because missed fraud can be costly and difficult to remedy. Precision nevertheless matters because excessive false positives can overwhelm institutions. The F1 score helps reveal the tension between these two objectives. This slide presents the central numerical findings. I would highlight that the model achieved perfect recall on the simulated corpus, which is impressive from a preventive perspective. However, the low precision means that many flagged cases would still require review, making the technical success incomplete unless paired with institutional mechanisms such as automated audit triage. This figure visualizes the score distributions underlying the performance results. The important point for the audience is that the thresholds are set to capture fraud comprehensively, but the clustering of legitimate transactions near those boundaries produces a large false positive zone. I would use the figure to show why the legal and operational conclusions of the paper follow logically from the data. I would explain that the results must be read through a governance lens, not a purely engineering lens. High recall is desirable because missed fraud can be more damaging than temporary inconvenience. But when precision is low, institutions may become overloaded. The key insight is that technological performance must be translated into workable compliance and audit processes. The paper's key conceptual contribution is the precision paradox. I would explain it as follows. If a regulator wants to maximize fraud capture, thresholds become stricter and more alerts are generated, but that very success can overwhelm audit capacity. The paradox therefore demonstrates why technical thresholds, audit automation, and legal reform must be designed together rather than sequentially. This figure translates the paper's reform logic into a layered architecture. I would explain that the governance layer sets rules and authority, the assurance layer performs AI-enabled detection and triage, and the operational layer is where banks generate the data and compliance events. The figure is useful because it shows that reform is not a single statute, but an integrated system of law, technology, and institutional practice. This slide focuses less on the institutional layers and more on process flow. I would walk the audience from input to output. Banking data enter the screening environment. AI tools produce fraud indicators, RPA manages triage and verification, and the resulting alerts feed compliance and enforcement pathways. The diagram demonstrates how the proposed framework would function in practice, rather than remaining purely conceptual. I would present these proposals as tightly connected to the doctrinal findings. The penal code requires definitional expansion because traditional fraud and forgery concepts do not adequately capture synthetic identities or biometric fabrication. The electronic transactions law also needs modernization because trust no longer depends only on documents and signatures. It depends on the integrity of digital identity and biometric authentication. This slide turns legislative reform into policy action. I would emphasize that the central bank is central because it can translate statutory reforms into supervisory standards. I would also stress that explainability is not merely a technical preference. It is important for evidence, fairness, and regulatory legitimacy. Together, these recommendations help convert the proposed legal architecture into day-to-day institutional practice. In closing, I would restate the paper's core message. Iraq's digital financial transition is not reversible, so legal modernization must catch up with technological reality. The contribution of the study is to connect doctrinal inadequacy with measurable operational consequences, and then present a coherent path toward reform. I would end by inviting questions on comparative law, implementation, or the simulation framework.